Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we're chatting with Jenny Chang, co-founder of the Pacific Atrocities Education and author of Marutas of Unit 731, Human Experimentation in the Forgotten Asian Auschwitz. Thank you for coming on to the podcast today, Jenny. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to chatting to you about your book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on here.
No worries. Reading your book, I found it, like, as a student of totalitarianism, I found it absolutely fascinating. And it's an area of totalitarianism and authoritarian leadership that I've just never looked at before, and especially from a Western perspective as well. We don't tend to look at these kind of things. But what sparked your interest in this topic?
Yeah, so my grandmother when I was growing up, my grandma told me about World War II history. She lived in Hong Kong at the time, and I had never learned about it because I grew up in the United States. I really had never learned about it much, and it's not in our textbook, so I kind of ignored it. I thought she was going through her senile moment. Sorry to put it like that, And then when she passed away, we found this box of military yen and some rice coupons, and that was like, wow, there's like real documents of what had happened to her. Like, this could have been real because she obviously has these like papers. And I don't know if you're familiar with military yen. In the beginning of the war, they had to force to trade in their currency to military yen. And so then in the beginning of the war, it was worth X amount of money, and then inflation and hyperinflation toward the end of the war. And then by the end of the war, they are not worth anything. They're just pieces of paper. And so I thought, well, if she actually has these items, it's probably very real what had happened to her. And so I started researching more into World War II in Asia. And at the time, there weren't too much about it. There was Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. And then there's also some comfort women books, the so-called hot topics of the Pacific Asia War. And then I went into this rabbit hole, and then I've realized that Dianne Feinstein had declassified a lot of the military documents in our national archives. And then I had also heard about the Rotten Lake village caused by Unit 731 in Yiwu in China. And so then I went through Wang Shen's work of the Rotten Lake Village, and then I also looked into the declassified documents, and I thought, wow, this is very messed up. If this is true, this is more fiction. I mean, this reality is more fiction than fiction, and it's very strange that this whole structure of human experimentation had happened, and biological attacks on soil, and there were farmers in Yiwu living with rotten lakes because like their soil was contaminated by biological weapon, and no one had heard about it. And these farmers were like living with rotten lakes for 70 years after the war. It was not until like 2014 that they figure out how to do skin grafting. So because of Unit 731, there was anthrax and glanders put into the soil of Yiwu and like other villages. And so then the farmers would just go about their day farming, and then their legs touch some contaminated soil, and then they will have rotten legs. Some legs are like rotten so bad that their limbs fall off. At first, contaminate the skin, and then if they don't disinfect it, then the limbs fall off. And so and the soil has been contaminated for decades, and it wasn't even and so there was this woman named Wang Shen who actually brought the farmers to sue the Japanese government. and the court had admitted that Unit 731 existed. And so it's like 70 years, and there's not too much about this topic. And so I thought this whole thing was very fascinating, because I mean it still has like modern impact in the world, that not a lot of people talk about. And yeah, so that's a long story.
And so it's really fascinating that you've managed to go from your grandmother's story right up until modern day to find stuff that inspired you to write your book and inspired you to bring this information to the public, really. Because I'd never heard of this kind of stuff that you were writing about. And I was, as someone who's grown up in the West, I've learned a lot about Auschwitz and the Holocaust, but like some of this stuff was really shocking, like even when I'd been taught that stuff. So
And you have a history degree, right?
Yeah, and I have a history degree.
So if you haven't heard about it, you don't expect a guy to know
exactly
about this.
And it should be on the level of the way we teach the Holocaust. And now that you're bringing this to people, especially with your foundation, we're able to bring these stories to life. But what was Unit 731?
It's a biological chemical research institute, founded by Ishii, a scientist who was very fascinated because he read about actually Ishii is an interesting guy because after there's not the more I read about him, the more I'm just like, wow, this guy had no ethics, no moral, and he thought biological weapon would be very, very good to use because he read in the Geneva Protocol that, oh, this is deadly. And so he thought, wow, if Geneva Protocol is having a whole agreement to stop countries from using biological warfare, this must be good. This must be good stuff. And so then sorry to say it like
That's
that,
fine.
but
No, that's completely
yeah.
understandable.
Yeah. And so then he was also very into he was born very wealthy. He was kind of a noble class, and so he was able to network and marry the daughter of his college counselor, and then yeah, and move on up from there. So yeah, he must have been charismatic because he had to get the emperor to give him that large amount of sum to start Unit 731, because we're talking about like a huge institute. At one point, like if you're a scientist in Japan working for um, the Japanese institute, you have some kind of like connection to Unit 731, and it's like a huge network of like some people call it death factory because their victims never escape the Ishii's network.
And you mentioned within your book that the unit has its roots in the US. How is something so crucial to the Japanese war machine begin in the United States?
Yeah, this is also interesting because he actually took a tour to MIT and see other people's research. And then he said, well, if they're, Japan is really falling behind in technology, because MIT is doing human research or like biological research. So why are we doing it? And so, yeah, and I think the Teddy Roosevelt connection to Conoco was also very interesting, because when Matthew Perry showed up to Japan, Japan was still a feudal society. And for them to open up because they had realized that, hey, China is not advancing technologically, and so they're now being dominated by the West. And so we need to catch up. Like we need to go fast. And so there was a politician named Conoco, Baron Conoco, and he had met with Well, first of all, it's very interesting because he grew up in an era where Japan is going from a feudal society to basically uh, Western uh, technological advancement, so it's opening up to the West. And he took on this tour of like visiting the Western countries, and seeing how they're like, and so then Japan can learn, and so then obviously he could speak. He was Harvard educated as well, and so he could speak like great English. And so then Teddy had met up with him and was very impressed and had thought that every Japanese can speak English like this, and said, "Wow, Japan is a very advanced Western country." Western inspired country, which is very weird because like if you think about it, he's totally looking at this from a Western lens. He had met one guy. He doesn't know, right? Like, and so he covered this. And so he brought because of how Barron convinced him that Japan is such a good Western country, had like everyone. I think at one point probably Teddy had imagined that Japan is even Christianized, like everyone is a Christian, blah blah blah. He was totally looking at it from a Western lens. And so he brought Barron to go fundraise at Wall Street, and Wall Street bought up all these Japanese bonds to further advance their because how else can you militarize your country without money? And so if you think about it, Wall Street funded Japan's military machine, which led to Japan defeating Russia, right? And then eventually Teddy Roosevelt won that Nobel Peace Prize for giving Korea to Japan in this negotiation. And then it went on to eventually Japan fighting the United States, which is in itself I feel like it's the definition of irony.
Oh, certainly. And then they definitely acquired areas, and again, that victory against the Russians that cause later issues, which is fascinating, really, because you have that Russian war, which weakens the Tsars, and Korea, which is its own other issue as well.
And then Japan took over Manchuria.
Just snowballs, really, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, it's very fascinating too, because like we don't really think about Japan in the United States in this kind of context, but then the more you read into it, the more it's just they're so involved with each other.
And it's that interlinking is really fascinating, really, because it's there at the beginning of Unit 731 and it's there at the end. But Ishii is that key figure for the Unit 731. So where does he originally choose to conduct this research, and why does he choose to research there?
Yeah, so obviously, even though that he's flamboyant, charismatic, he can't do human experimentation in the middle of Tokyo. It's just bizarre. He's gonna get caught. And so he thought, and then also Japan had just colonized this great big huge landmass in Manchuria, and he thought, well, let's go. And so then he went on a summer trip with his BFF to Manchuria to kind of scout out and see if we can conduct human experimentation there, and like have his new like fantasy sponsored by the government. And so then he decided Manchuria is a perfect place because it's a Japanese colony, but it's remote enough for him to do his human experimentation. So he emptied out this soy sauce factory and then called it his own Zoma Institute, where he was doing human experimentation. But obviously, it good things don't last too long. It eventually got, and he actually invited his superior to come and like visit, and his superior was actually very impressed with his research, which just like explained to you how little they regarded human lives, right? Like his superior came and saw his research and was impressed.
And that's that's quite dark, actually, that, you know, they just didn't regard these people as people. And you give them they were given a type of name, Marutas. What does that mean? And
Marutas.
oh, Marutas, yeah.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and why were these people chosen, really?
They're called logs because they were it was when they were building it, they were asking like, oh, what is this for? And then someone just jokingly said, oh, this is for our newest log lumber factory, but they were just regarding, and then that joke stuck. Well, that dark joke. And it's very dark if you think about it. And they just kind of disregard people as people. They kind of call it as logs. And um, and later you see from their research that, you know, they don't call it people by name. It's kind of just like log X, so Maruta X or Maruta 1, and then they'll go from Maruta 1 to 100 during their human experimentation, and then after 100 they'll start again from 1 to 100. And so you never really know how many victims were in Unit 731, because they would be called, for example, for one research, they would say Maruta 1 to 100, and then they will start over 1 to 100, and then their bodies are put into incinerators, and so they get cremated right after. So, and documents even survive after the surrender. So we really don't know how many victims are in Unit 731.
And it seems to be that, and that shows a very efficient kind of war machine, a very efficient kind of culture that was brought together there. But what kind of, you know, there's a huge number of people being churned through and out of this machine, but what kind of experiments were they being part of, and what was happening to them?
Yeah, there's vivisection without any kind of painkiller, really, because if they thought, you know, any kind of medicine that would really interfere with their research. There's blood being drawn until, you know, they're I would think at one point they were trying to figure out if they can do blood transfusion between the horse and human. They were trying to also figure out how to fix, because Manchuria is a very cold place, and so they were trying to learn how to do frostbites, how to cure frostbites. I think that was one of Ishii's really breaking research. They were also doing anthrax. One of the scientists, Naito, was very, would you call it cutting edge? Yeah, he was
Yeah.
very innovative. Yeah, innovative, cutting edge kind of guy, and figured out how to dissimulate anthrax via powder. And he later became CEO of a pharmaceutical company. Yeah, these people, these scientists who worked there were really innovative. They were really brilliant minded, and they were paid off handsomely even after the war.
And it seems to be that the Japanese got a lot from this kind of research, and we did too. So how much information was helped the Japanese war effort that was gained from Unit 731?
So this is a very interesting. I had thought about it a lot, this question, because there were moments. So let's go back to the Zoma structure, right? So eventually he got found out, even though that he wasn't too, he was being very secretive about it, but he wasn't too secretive about it. So then, and during Mid-Autumn Festival, some guards were drunk, and then some prisoners broke out. And so, but then the generals were already very impressed with his research. And so they thought, well, it's working, but it's not. We just need to have a bigger institute for them. This the Zoma thing was just too small for Ishii's ambition. And so they founded a thing called Ping Fong Institute, and I thought that was very fascinating because like Ping Fong was much bigger. They even had an anti-testing ground where Ishii can dream of like bombs to really dissimulate his biological weapons, and he came up with these porcelain bombs for dissimulating biological weapon. And I mean, I feel like up to this day, we're still trying to figure out because at one point I think in Harbin they were trying to develop some land, and then um someone got anthrax and glanders from just working on the ground. And so I feel like there must have been a lot more biological weapon that is still not uncovered to this day. And if the war wasn't ended so quickly, he had also planned these bombs for California as well. And um, so, yeah. But then there were also some. So he was very proud of his innovation in Unit 731, and then in some battles he wanted to show. He really wanted to show off his weapons, and it ended up backfiring on his own troops at one of the battles. Um, and so, was it very effective? I'm not sure. Well, like on some battlegrounds, because he really needed to train his troops, and I think there was a lack of time and like miscommunication. But he definitely had invented a lot of things that were used in warfare with biological weapons.
It's very interesting to see how not only were they pursuing a conventional war with aircraft and so on, but actually expanding with this kind of research. And some of the biological weaponry that you talk about within your book is really quite haunting, but detailed research into how to disseminate these kind of biological agents to have the best impact. But it wasn't just one research unit. Yeah, how many different research units were there, and what did these different units do? Did they all specialize in different things?
Yeah, so he also had Unit 100, which specialized in animals, and there's a lot. And then they had a unit that produced um, biological weapons. There's also units that produce chemical weapons, and so I mean, this is millions of dollars of research that was signed on by the emperor, right? Some people say, oh, the emperor didn't know about this, but his seal, if you read my book, there's a document from the emperor who had his seal this on this amount of sum to give to Ishishiro. So how could he not have known that this was going on, right? And so yeah, I just thought it's yeah, so it's a very huge and complex unit. It's not just Unit 731. It's also producing weapons. It's also because they also needed to work with Kanpei to get delivery of these logs or Marutas, right? And so that needed transportation. And so it's a whole supply chain of people.
In both ways, people providing and providing the supplies as well. So it's
yeah, really.
and and for definitely Japan at this period has by some been characterized as totalitarian. So it's very difficult to even imagine that the emperor didn't have knowledge of what was going on. So
No.
it's it's fascinating how it goes absolutely to the top. And
Yeah, and it's for people who thought like the emperor was a puppet and whatever. I don't know if you know about Prince Konoe, who was 3 times prime minister in wartime Japan. Yeah, he took a cyanide right before his trial, And then he wrote a memoir, and I really I found it in the declassified documents as well. If you look under my name on Amazon, there's Prince Konoe, and it explains to it, and it explains in there that like maybe the emperor was not so innocent after all. It's kind of a myth that the emperor was an innocent guy who didn't know what was happening.
And then we have the experience at the very top, and then down at the very
Mm.
bottom, what do these logs experience within the research units, and what was happening to them, and then how long were they expected to live as well? Because we're churning through thousands, maybe millions of people. How
Yeah,
long?
not very long. Like your life expectancy is fairly reduced in these prison cells, and because it's not just prison cells, right? It's also they had anti-testing station. It's like a whole ground. Ishii had his own plane to drop his porcelain bomb onto these people to figure out like what is the reaction time with anthrax and glanders and other agents into these people. And so then the logs were tied into stake onto this open air ground. And Ishii and his jet or his own personal plane would just drop the bomb there. And then there were also people who were just they would take the blood out to see how humans can live without blood. There's also pressure chamber where they test for humans' ability to live in under certain pressure to develop airplanes. There's all kinds of experiments. So you'll be lucky if you're a log and you can live for 2 weeks in Ishii's network.
Oh Christ! So that's a dramatically decreased lifespan, and
Yeah.
with you also speak rather vividly about the kind of injections and the experimentations. And one thing that really stuck out for me was the moment where the log had to stick his arm through the jail cell. Can you let us know about that and what happened in these kind of situations?
Yeah, I think I described it in my book very vividly about, um, well, because this is like biological research factories, and so they're actually kept very clean, and whatever they needed, they just write in for an order for the to take in another human body. It's so it's they treat human as not human, right? And then they are you talking about the incident where they were injected a cyanide, or which incident are you
The
talking about?
take, the
Because
take, or both of them really. Both of them really. They're both they're both haunting really to read.
yeah, um which ones stuck out to you? Because I wrote so many things
Uh,
that were so horrific. I don't know if I can
fair.
even say it out loud.
Well, it's a history podcast. You're more than welcome to. But particularly the taking of the blood, um, with with the other prisoners within the same cell.
Maybe you can describe
Yeah,
it because I don't really want to say it out loud.
fair enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. When they'd asked one of the prisoners to come and have his blood taken, he didn't have enough energy or enough power to get himself to the cell, so they ordered the others to take him to the door of the cell. I just found that really quite typifying the experience of these people within the unit. I found it quite dark, but again, really informative for their
And it's very
experiences.
replaceable for these people. And then I was also very disturbed by the fact that some of these people who were working in Unit 731, delivering human beings, blah, 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 cutting up for organs, they were just 17-year-old working for Ishii's network on the bottom of the bottom, right? And you don't think about teenagers, 17-year-olds cutting up for organs, or like being so blinded to human suffering. So I thought that was interesting as well, because that was just very disturbing to me.
Well, that actually leads into my next question. What was it like for the people within the unit who were working there as scientists?
Well, scientists, they're just doing the research, right? They're just expecting to, because like I said before, at one point, if you're working for the science committee or community, you're working for Ishishiro. So they really are just working to advance. You can read from some of their documents that they see it as blindly. There's no regard of human lives. And then for the youth corps people who actually had to do the grunt work, delivering human bodies, cutting up organs, whatever. Those are the interesting ones, because they were so, I would call it brainwash. They were so patriotic for their cause that I would say they sacrificed at such a young age to really work for this kind of that factory. And then one of the thing that really struck me is, like, at the end of the war, one of the nurses, like, who had been working at Unit 731, is like in the train, escaping. And then Ishii said to her personally, "Hey, if anyone hear about this, I will make sure your family and you have no future." And and that really struck me. I mean, at one point, the staff of Unit 731, they're just staff, they're doing mundane work. To them, they're already so numb to it. And then at the end of the war, to have Ishii come up to you and say that must have been very interesting of an experience for them, I
And
feel like.
and even for Ishii to actually get personally involved in telling them as well shows how important
Hmm.
and vital that research actually was.
Hmm.
And
And
it's
Ishii's such an interesting guy, because at the end of the war, he faked his own death, and he had his own, like, fake funeral in his village. And then the CIA found him. um yeah, so I thought that was interesting for him to have done the whole show like that.
well, you've really gone through all the stages, haven't you? After you faked your death, there's no way you can go. But
Yeah.
you're touching on Ishii and the CIA, and again, it brings us back to America. A lot of these scientists, what happened to them after the end of the war?
So there was a trial in Russia for some of the selected scientists, but I don't think they really face any justice at all, because it's just like the maximum sentence, I think, was like maybe just 10 to 12 years. And then one guy committed suicide in the cell. And then, like I said, the guy who invented anthrax eventually became a prominent became as executive in a pharmaceutical company. Some of the Unit 731 workers became prominent politicians. The CIA found Ishii. Ishii submitted some of his report on anthrax, which was later used in the Korean War. Yeah, so really, you can do quite evil in the world and do quite well for yourself later.
And that's replicated in the West as well, with the same thing happening with the Nazi scientists. So it's really quite harrowing for me how much the West actually rated these scientists, even after all this horror. And
Yeah.
it's quite sad as well that they managed to get away with it. But
And human lives are so cheap when you're reading about all these human experimentation to advance for science. You just and there's it's not just like during human experimentation, right? It's like uh, when they're trying to conquer a place during an invasion, you're just wondering, like, how much is a human life worth? And it's not just like the victims at the um death factory or human experimentation table itself, it's also when they dissimulate this kind of germ warfare onto soil, right? Then there are like other people who get affected by this warfare, by this biological warfare, and also by Unit 731. So then you wonder, like, with the kind of um I'll call it exponential growth, right? It's kind of exponential. And so how many people were actually affected by this?
And
It's
and even 70, 80 years afterwards, like you said, there were still people being affected by what Unit 731 had done in these
mhm,
areas.
yeah.
And you mentioned within your book that Ishii drops these, and we've touched on it very slightly, that Ishii managed to drop these bombs on places. Um, what it wasn't only anthrax that he was dropping as well. So what was he dropping on these places, and what places was he dropping these bombs on?
Anthrax and glanders. Um, in Zhejiang provinces. Yeah, it's also as a revenge. I don't know if you heard of the Doolittle air raid. Of course, you've heard about it. They needed to bomb Tokyo, and so then as a revenge, because Zhejiang was used as an air base, and so then um, they thought to bomb this area that Doolittle was launching airplanes from. And so again, the U.S. Japan China relationship that no one really talks of.
And I find it fascinating as well, the how that how Japan had developed from nothing to something at this period, and China was still languishing behind and being punished by Japan for previous actions. And the use
Well,
of
be,
the
well,
use.
but then
Oh,
that
sorry.
also goes back to the Teddy Roosevelt and Baron Conoco, because Conoco was speaking English so well that uh, Teddy Roosevelt had in mind that they should be the Japanese, that they should hold up the Monroe Doctrine of Asia, and so then Japan dominated Asia for during that period of time. And I find it so interesting that it was Roosevelt's cousin who takes care of, who was in power during this time. It's like their whole family. Uh, it's kind of like plutocracy if you think about it.
And one thing I found particularly interesting was the harvesting of the plague from the fleas as well, for something that was so medieval in many people's minds, to be used as a biological weapon was absolutely
Mhm.
fascinating. Can you tell us what they did with the plague?
Yeah, they spread the plague into these villages, and then at first, one third of these villages would die. And then if the people who don't die would also get anthrax and glanders, and so then they'll end up with rotten legs. Which, okay, think about it as also a human resource kind of mentality, right? If your job was to breed fleas filled with plague, I think that would be pretty awful as a job description.
Yeah.
But people did it. But people did it. I mean, when I was reading these documents, I thought it was like kind of bizarre to me that
But did they have a choice, really?
as a scientist or as people who are working, I don't know. It's wartime. It's emergency, right? So I don't think people had a choice. But how would you feel if your job description is to breed fleas
Yeah.
with plague?
But I don't think I'd say anything to Ishii. So
Yeah, me neither. I would not
no.
say anything to my boss. Yeah.
So how much of this, there's an ethical question here, and you've mentioned the ethical question earlier.
Mhm.
Um, how much of this information gathered by Unity 731 within the war do we still use today?
Um, yeah, I think so, because Ford Dietrich in the United States were trying to do some kind of human experimentation, And then obviously it was stopped. And then they thought, well, we don't really need to do human experimentation if some of the research questions were already answered by Unit 731. So in exchange of, I would say, Ishii's freedom, he submitted his own research to the CIA when they found him. Um, and it's very fascinating because like he would say something, they were asking him like, oh, how to dissimulate the germ, and then he would like laugh at their question and they kind of manipulate them. um I think their whole exchange was also very interesting, and then you can tell by their exchanges like how manipulative Ishii was as a person, even through like the translation and such. um so I think, we still use it as war in warfare today.
And that's, again, fascinating and harrowing that something that happened in World War II is still being used today, but it's probably being used in a very different way to save people's lives as opposed to murder people. Because
Hmm.
as we mentioned earlier, the Geneva Convention kind of forbids this kind of warfare. Is there
Yeah.
anything from Unit 731 that really, really sticks out to you and was probably one of the most harrowing parts for you to research?
I'm very afraid of the cold. That's why I live in California. And so it's so fascinating to me that they would go and expose human limbs outside to figure out how to do frostbites. That detail was very crazy to me because they just left outside with no no clothes on really, and then if the limbs were frozen, they cut it off to check out what's going on inside the limb as it's frozen. That was disgusting to me. It still makes me very sick thinking about it. What about you? What about your
Oh,
most vivid detail?
to me, it really was the taking of the blood through the cell with his cellmates holding him up. To me, that just showed the very human side of the whole thing. Because
Yeah.
I'm mainly a political historian, so anything political I kind of go, oh, awesome. But anything kind of, I'm not a social historian in any way, shape, or form, but things like that really stick out to me, and I find fascinating.
And a lot of people think it's only it only impacted the Chinese people, but as actually no, they were trying to diversify their human experimentation and see how it affects like different races, and so they also gather some POWs and also some Russians because Manchuria is so close to Russia to figure out how this human experimentation works. So I thought that was also interesting to me to see like they really didn't care about anyone.
Well, it's as a lot of them would
Yeah.
say, it's wartime and all cards are off the table, really, aren't they? Because people
Yeah.
tend to ignore, or at that point, the League of Nations and the Geneva Convention and so on. So, thank you very much for enlightening us about your book, Jenny. And now I have a
Yeah.
final fun question. We do these kind of questions for everyone who comes on the History of Jackson podcast. So, you're based in California, specifically San Francisco, if I'm right.
Hmm.
What are your three favorite things to do in your city?
So before the pandemic, um, my city was a very fun place. Honestly, no, seriously, I love going to the arcade. I love hiking. I like eating out.
Now, some of our readers might absolutely love your book, which I do
Oh,
thoroughly
thank you.
recommend to people. Um, if they want to interact with the topic more and learn more about Unit 731, Japan in the War, what do you recommend that they go out and read?
That Factory by Harris Sheldon is also very good. Um, we also have a lot of books you can see from our website, pacificatrocities.org. We talk about um, the Pacific Asia War. Um, we talk really a lot about Pacific Asia War that no one really thought about. I had never thought about the Philippines in the war. have you taken a look at our Philippine selection?
Yeah, you've got a really large selection of stuff that's looking at other parts of Asia as well, which I find quite fascinating. That
And I never really thought of Thailand as a place in Asia that had never been really colonized before. And looking at their political strategy was also very interesting, like how they played the UK and the United States, and they would during the war they would never put like two countries in the same event together, and so then they were able to one-on-one strategize on how to stay independent, which I thought was very fascinating because Thailand is such a small country. It was like next to a lot of, heavy hit places in World War II, and yet they were able to do their own thing. Really was quite something.
So I'll make sure for our readers that all the links for those are in the description below, or listeners as well, so they can go check them out for themselves. And then if people want to find your book and you online and they want to keep up to date with you, where can they find you?
Well, for history, I think they can just go to the Pacific Atrocities website, and yeah, you can sign up for email lists, and I'll definitely hit up your inbox at least every month. Yeah.
And I do thoroughly recommend Jenny's book because it is a great read. And definitely for us as Westerners, it's great to get a perspective on the Pacific theatre, because a lot of our educations, particularly in the UK, is very Eurocentric. So I thoroughly recommend reading Jenny's book.
Thank you.
That's okay. Well,
and I'm going to read your book as well, because I just read the description and I thought, wow, that's very interesting.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Jenny. I really appreciate it. And thank you very much for listening, guys. Really appreciate you guys listening.